When Britain went to war in September 1939, the standard anti-tank gun mounted on nearly every British cruiser and infantry tank was the QF 2-pounder. The designation sounds quaint now, almost Victorian in its terminology, but that 2-pounder referred to the weight of the shell it fired, a 40mm projectile that weighed roughly 2 pounds. On paper, the decision made perfect sense. British military doctrine in the late 1930s emphasized speed and maneuverability over heavy armor. The thinking went like this: tanks would exploit breakthroughs, race through enemy lines, and engage other tanks in fast-moving duels where agility mattered more than brute firepower. The 2-pounder was adopted in 1938 after trials showed it could penetrate 50mm of armor at reasonable combat ranges against the Panzer I's and II's that Germany fielded in the Spanish Civil War. That seemed entirely adequate. The gun had a decent rate of fire, roughly 12 rounds per minute in ideal conditions, and it was light enough to be installed in the relatively small turrets British designers favored. Everything looked sensible in the testing grounds of Lulworth and Thetford. The problem was that warfare doesn't happen on testing grounds. France, May 1940, delivered the first brutal lessons. British tank crews rolling into Belgium and northern France discovered that German Panzer III's and IV's weren't the thin-skinned targets their instructors had described. The Panzer III, which became the Wehrmacht's workhorse medium tank, carried 30mm of frontal armor in its early variants, manageable for the 2-pounder at close range. But combat rarely happens at the ranges written in training manuals. Engagements occurred at 800, 1,000, sometimes 1,200 yards, and at those distances, the 2-pounder's solid shot simply didn't carry enough kinetic energy. Crews reported shells bouncing off German hulls with a distinctive metallic pinging sound that became sickeningly familiar. What made matters worse was the complete absence of a high-explosive round for the 2-pounder. British doctrine assumed tanks would fight tanks and anti-tank guns would fire armor-piercing shot exclusively. No one seriously considered that tank crews might need to suppress infantry positions, destroy fortifications, or engage soft-skinned vehicles. The 2-pounder could do precisely one job, and by 1940 it was becoming clear it couldn't even do that job particularly well. German crews, meanwhile, enjoyed the versatility of guns that could fire both armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition. A Panzer IV's 75mm gun could demolish a building, scatter infantry, or, when needed, punch through moderate armor. British tankers had no such luxury. The evacuation from Dunkirk in June 1940 left the British Army stripped of most of its heavy equipment. In the desperate scramble to rebuild armored units, the 2-pounder remained standard issue for one simple reason. Britain had the manufacturing capacity to produce it in quantity, and nothing else was ready. The 6-pounder, which would eventually replace it, existed only as drawings and prototypes. In 1940, switching production lines mid-crisis was unthinkable. So the 2-pounder soldiered on, equipping the new Matilda Secus Crusaders and Valentine tanks rolling out of factories in Birmingham, Leeds, and Newcastle. By late 1940, intelligence reports from North Africa confirmed what France had already taught. German armor was getting thicker. The Panzer III Ausfuhr, entering service in early 1941, boasted 50mm of frontal armor. Against that, the 2-pounder became a liability rather than an asset. British crews needed to close to suicidally close ranges, 300 yards or less, to guarantee penetration. At those distances, German return fire was devastatingly accurate. The equation was simple and grim. To kill a Panzer III, a British tank had to get close enough that the Panzer III could easily kill it first. North Africa became the proving ground where German confidence transformed into outright contempt. When Rommel's Africa Corps arrived in Tripoli in February 1941, his panzer crews had already seen action in Poland and France. They knew their equipment, trusted their tactics, and believed, with some justification, that they were the finest armored force in the world. What they didn't expect was that British tanks would make their jobs quite so easy. The first major clash came at Mersa el Brega in late March 1941. British cruiser tanks, nearly all equipped with 2-pounders, engaged German Panzer III's and IV's in the open desert, where long-range gunnery determined outcomes. German after-action reports from that engagement contain a telling detail. Multiple panzer commanders reported hearing metallic impacts on their hulls, but experiencing no penetrations. One commander, Lieutenant Hans von Luck of the 7th Panzer Division, later wrote that his crew initially thought they were under machine gun fire because the strikes seemed so ineffectual. When his gunner identified the source as British tank guns, the crew's reaction was disbelief followed by something close to laughter. This wasn't isolated. Throughout April and May 1941, as Rommel pushed British forces back toward the Egyptian frontier, German tank crews developed an almost casual attitude toward frontal engagements with British armor. They learned they could simply angle their hulls slightly, presenting the armor at an oblique angle, and 2-pounder rounds would ricochet without causing damage. Panzer crew diaries from this period contain repeated references to Die kleine Spitzekanone, the little pointy gun, a dismissive nickname for the 2-pounder, that spread through the Afrika Korps like wildfire. The technical reality backed up their contempt, a Panzer III Ausfuhr, which became common in North Africa by mid-1941, had 50 millimeters of homogeneous armor on the front glasses. At 500 yards, a typical desert engagement range, a 2-pounder solid shot carried approximately 55 millimeters of penetration under ideal perpendicular impact. But ideal never happens in combat. Any angle beyond perpendicular dramatically increased the effective thickness. At 30 degrees from perpendicular, that 50 millimeter plate became effectively 58 millimeters. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. British tank guns simply couldn't do the job they were designed for. Operation Crusader in November 1941 demonstrated the scale of the problem. British forces outnumbered German tanks roughly 2-1 yet struggled to achieve decisive results. At Sidi Rezeg on November 23rd, the 7th Armored Brigade lost 113 tanks in a single day of fighting. German losses were 72 tanks. But the critical difference was that many German tanks were recovered and repaired. British tanks with 2-pounders had to close to point-blank range to kill anything, and at point-blank range they died. German crews began calling engagements with British cruisers Panzer Safari, a hunting expedition, rather than a battle between equals. The psychological dimension mattered as much as the technical one. When you know your opponent's gun can't hurt you beyond a certain range, you fight differently. German tactics evolved to exploit this advantage ruthlessly. Panzer commanders would deliberately draw British tanks into pursuing them, then wheel about at a predetermined range where German guns were effective, but British guns were not. It was systematic slaughter dressed up as tactical maneuver. One German gunner interviewed after his capture in early 1942 told his interrogators that engaging British tanks felt unsporting, like shooting rabbits. By the time of the Gazala battles in May and June 1942, the pattern was set. British tankers knew they were outgunned. German tankers knew it too. The 2-pounder had become a punchline in the Afrika Korps, proof that British engineering prioritized everything, except the one thing that mattered most: the ability to kill the enemy before he killed you. The 6-pounder finally reached British units in significant numbers during the spring of 1942, and for a brief moment, it seemed the balance might shift. The new 57mm gun could penetrate 70 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, a substantial improvement that let British crews engage at more sensible ranges. Crews celebrated its arrival. Tank commanders who had survived months with 2-pounders described the 6-pounder as a revelation. Finally, they could hurt German tanks without driving into near-certain death. Then, in August 1942 near Leningrad, the Tiger I made its combat debut. When intelligence reports filtered back to British analysts describing an enemy tank with 100 millimeters of frontal armor and an 88mm gun, the initial reaction was skepticism. Surely the Germans hadn't built something that monstrous. Captured documents and interrogations confirmed the nightmare. They absolutely had. The Tiger. I weighed 56 tons, carried armor that shrugged off every gun in the British arsenal, and mounted a weapon derived from the fearsome 88mm anti-aircraft gun that had already terrorized Allied tankers in North Africa. Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943 became the crucible where British crews confronted this new reality. The first confirmed Tiger kill by British forces occurred on January 19, 1943, near Roba Valley. but it required a Churchill tank to fire 76mm rounds at extremely close range, under 200 yards, into the Tiger's rear deck before finally achieving penetration. 7 shots into the rear armor at ranges where infantry could throw grenades. That single engagement told British tank crews everything they needed to know about their chances in a conventional duel. The 6-pounder could penetrate a Tiger's side armor under ideal conditions, but frontal engagement was suicide. Crews developed desperate tactics. Try to disable the tracks, flank undercover, aim for vision ports, pray the Tiger crew makes a mistake. None of these were proper tactical solutions. They were survival strategies born of equipment inadequacy. By February 1943, British armored regiments in Tunisia were filing reports with identical conclusions. We need a gun that can kill these things from the front, or we need to stop sending tanks against them entirely. March 1943 brought worse news. Intelligence confirmed that Germany was fielding a new medium tank, called the Panther, equipped with a 75mm high-velocity gun and frontal armor exceeding 80mm at steep angles, effectively 120+ millimeters against flat trajectory fire. The Panther combined the Tiger's near invulnerability with superior speed and maneuverability. Unlike the Tiger, which was produced in limited numbers, Panthers would be manufactured by the thousands. British tank designers realized with dawning horror that they weren't just losing the arms race, they were being lapped. British cruiser morale reports from mid-1943 make grim reading. Men who'd fought through North Africa with inadequate guns now faced the prospect of invading Europe against enemies whose basic medium tank outclassed Britain's best cruisers. The psychological toll was measurable. Tank crew retention rates dropped. Training instructors reported that new crews, once briefed on German armor capabilities, sometimes requested transfers to infantry or artillery units where their chances seemed marginally better. The War Office response oscillated between urgency and paralysis. The 17-pounder existed. We'll get to its development shortly. But integrating it into existing tank designs proved nightmarishly complex. The gun was large, the recoil enormous, and British turret rings were too small to accommodate it without substantial redesign. Stopgap measures were proposed: towed anti-tank versions, self-propelled mountings on American tank chassis, experimental installations that never quite worked. Meanwhile, planning for the Normandy invasion accelerated, and everyone understood that British tanks would be landing in France with guns that couldn't reliably penetrate the enemy they'd face. The 17-pounder's origins traced back to May 1941, when the British Directorate of Artillery correctly anticipated that future German tanks would carry armor beyond the 6-pounder's capability. The specification called for a 76.2mm gun capable of penetrating 130 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, a performance level that seemed almost fantastical compared to what British tankers were actually using. Vickers Armstrong received the contract and their design team faced immediate problems. The physics of anti-tank guns follow merciless rules. To penetrate thicker armor, you need higher velocity. Higher velocity requires either a larger propellant charge or a longer barrel, preferably both. The 17-pounder would eventually feature a barrel 55 calibers long, meaning the tube extended 55 times the bore diameter. That's over 4 meters of steel that needed to withstand chamber pressures exceeding 20 tons per square inch. The recoil forces were staggering, roughly 60 tons at peak. For context, that's like having a double-decker bus slam backward into the mounting every time you pulled the trigger. Prototypes went through trials in late 1941 and early 1942. The towed version, designated Ordnance QF 17-pounder, performed magnificently on the testing range against captured Panzer III plates. The armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, APDS for short, punched through as though the steel were cardboard. The sabot round itself represented a clever bit of engineering. A lightweight aluminum sleeve held a dense tungsten penetrator core. Upon leaving the barrel, the sleeve fell away and the core continued at velocities approaching 2,000 meters per second. At that speed, kinetic energy overcame virtually any armor then in service. Production approval came in late 1942, but manufacturing a precision gun with such demanding tolerances took time. The first production 17-pounders reached units in February 1943, initially as towed anti-tank guns for the Royal Artillery. These proved devastatingly effective in Tunisia. On February 27, 1943, near Hunt's Gap, a single 17-pounder battery destroyed 5 Tigers in one engagement, 3 of them at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. German crews who'd felt invulnerable suddenly faced a weapon that negated their armor advantage completely. The problem was that towed guns couldn't exploit breakthroughs or keep pace with armored advances. Britain needed the 17-pounder in tanks, not just in static defensive positions. That's where the engineering challenges became truly nightmarish. The turret ring diameter of the Cromwell, Britain's newest cruiser tank, measured 54 inches. The 17-pounder's recoil mechanism and breech required a turret ring of at least 60 inches to accommodate the gun's traverse, and the crew space needed to operate it. Redesigning the Cromwell's hull to accept a larger turret ring would have meant essentially creating a new tank, an 18-month process, minimum. Britain didn't have 18 months. Normandy was coming. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. British ordnance officers examined the American M4 Sherman, which the United States was supplying in large numbers through Lend-Lease. The Sherman's turret ring measured 69 inches, plenty of room. In January 1944, Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge proposed a crash program to install 17-pounders in Sherman hulls. The idea seemed mad. The Sherman had never been designed for such a heavy gun, but desperation breeds ingenuity. The Firefly conversion required brutal compromises. The radio had to be moved from the turret to the hull. The loader's position became cramped to the point of claustrophobia. The gun's length made the tank noticeably nose-heavy, affecting handling. The muzzle brake, essential to manage recoil, created a distinctive blast signature that made Fireflies easy to identify on the battlefield. None of that mattered. What mattered was that Britain finally had a tank-mounted gun capable of killing Tigers and Panthers frontally at combat ranges. By June 1944, British armored regiments landing in Normandy carried a mix of standard Shermans and the new Fireflies, typically distributed at a ratio of 1 Firefly per troop of 4 tanks. The allocation reflected manufacturing realities. Britain simply couldn't convert every Sherman in time for the invasion. Tank commanders were told explicitly that Fireflies were to be preserved for engagements with heavy German armor. Wasting a 17-pounder on a half-track or a fortified position wasn't just tactically questionable, it was potentially catastrophic. If a Tiger or Panther appeared later without a Firefly available to counter it, German armored units in Normandy entered the campaign with institutional confidence that bordered on arrogance. Panzer crews had spent years establishing psychological dominance over British tanks. They'd learned in North Africa and Italy that British guns required suicidal closing ranges to achieve kills. Veterans passed this knowledge to replacement crews. Keep your front towards the enemy. Maintain engagement distance and British tanks die easily. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, positioned near Caen, had received this doctrine as gospel. Their Panthers were mechanically superb, their crews fanatically motivated, and their tactical assumptions fatally outdated. The first major engagement came on June 7, 1944, near Puteaux-en-Bessin. The 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards encountered elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division in the Bocage country south of the landing beaches. The terrain, small fields divided by thick hedgerows and sunken lanes, limited engagement ranges and made maneuver difficult. A troop of Shermans, including Sergeant Bramal's Firefly, took defensive positions along a tree line. As German tanks advanced through an orchard roughly 600 yards distant, the German commander clearly expected a conventional engagement. His Panzer IV moved forward aggressively, angling the hull to present maximum effective armor. At 600 yards, a standard Sherman 75mm gun would have struggled to guarantee penetration against that angle. Bramal's gunner, Trooper Eklund, had different tools. The 17-pounder's APDS round left the barrel at 2,000 meters per second and struck the Panzer IV's front glacis with 150 millimeters worth of penetration. The German tank erupted, its ammunition cooking off in a fireball visible across the battlefield. The next Panzer IV in line immediately reversed, smoke grenades popping. German radio traffic intercepted and translated, later revealed confused commanders asking what gun had achieved that kill. They'd seen the hit. They knew the angle. They couldn't reconcile how a Sherman had penetrated frontal armor from that range. The answer, that this wasn't a standard Sherman, took weeks to percolate through German intelligence networks. June and early July brought repeated shocks to German armored doctrine. Near Villers-Bocage on June 13th, Fireflies from the County of London Yeomanry engaged Panthers at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards and achieved multiple kills. On June 18th, during Operation Epsom, a single Firefly from the 23rd Hussars destroyed 2 Panthers and a Panzer IV in under 3 minutes. The pattern was consistent. German tanks maneuvered as though facing 75mm guns, close to what they thought were safe engagement ranges, and died. The psychological impact on German crews was immediate and profound. Prisoners taken in late June described a spreading paranoia within panzer units. Crews who'd felt secure behind 80mm of frontal armor now understood that any Sherman might carry a gun capable of killing them at any range. The distinctive long barrel of the Firefly made them priority targets, but in the chaos of bocage fighting, identification wasn't always possible until after the first shot. That first shot increasingly came from a 17-pounder, and increasingly, it was the last thing German crews experienced. Villers-Bocage itself had already entered British military mythology for the wrong reasons. On June 13, 1944, Michael Wittmann's Tiger destroyed an entire column of the 7th Armored Division in a devastating ambush that left 14 tanks and 15 other vehicles burning in the town's narrow streets. British newspapers reported the disaster with barely concealed horror. What they didn't report, because it hadn't happened yet, was what occurred when Wittmann attempted to repeat his success later that same day. Around 1300 hours, Wittmann's Tiger, along with 4 Panzer IVs, pushed into the southern edge of Villers-Bocage's bocage, where they encountered a squadron of the County of London Yeomanry. Among the British tanks was Firefly Troop Leader, commanded by Sergeant Stan Lockwood. The German tanks approached with the casual confidence of predators who'd never met anything that could hurt them. Lockwood's gunner, Trooper Joe Eklund, tracked the lead Panzer IV through his sight as it crossed a gap between buildings at roughly 800 yards. The 17-pounder spoke once. The Panzer IV's turret separated from its hull, blown clean off by the force of its ammunition exploding. The 2nd Panzer Saarpors attempted to reverse, but the confined street made maneuvering impossible. Eklund's second shot penetrated the lower glasses and the tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from every hatch. Wittmann's Tiger, recognizing genuine danger for perhaps the first time that day, withdrew rapidly behind a stone wall. The ambusher had become the ambushed. Throughout late June and early July, similar reversals occurred across the Normandy front. On June 25th near Choux, Fireflies from the 9th Royal Tank Regiment engaged Panthers from the 9th SS Panzer Division at ranges between 900 and 1,200 yards. British after-action reports recorded 7 Panthers destroyed for the loss of 2 Fireflies, a kill ratio that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The critical factor wasn't just the 17-pounder's penetration. It was that British crews could now engage at ranges where German return fire, while still dangerous, wasn't automatically lethal. Towed 17-pounders proved equally devastating in defensive positions. Operation Goodwood, launched on July 18, 1944, saw the largest British armored assault of the Normandy campaign. German forces had prepared defensive positions in depth, including carefully sighted anti-tank guns, but the British had done likewise. A single 17-pounder battery positioned on the Bourget-Bousse Ridge engaged Panthers attempting to counterattack the British penetration. Over a 3-hour period, that battery destroyed 11 Panthers, a Tiger, and 4 Panzer IVs. The gun's high velocity meant first-round hit probability remained excellent even at extended ranges where German return fire struggled to locate the well-camouflaged British positions. German tactical reports from this period reveal a force grappling with strategic surprise. A Panther Battalion commander in the 12th SS wrote on July 3rd that his crews had been assured by intelligence that British tank guns remained inferior to ours in both range and penetration. His battalion had lost 14 Panthers in 2 days, most to frontal hits at ranges his crews thought were safe. He concluded acidly that intelligence might wish to revise their assessments in light of actual battlefield conditions. Prisoner interrogations provided even starker testimony. A Panther commander from the 2nd Panzer Division, captured on July 11th near Hill 112, told his interrogators that German crews had developed a saying, "When the lange Rohr, the long barrel, points, we die." The Firefly's distinctive silhouette had become a harbinger of death. Captured German tactical orders from late July instructed crews to prioritize destroying Fireflies above all other targets, even if it meant exposing their flanks to standard Shermans. The desperation in that instruction speaks volumes. The erosion of German armored superiority did more than change tactical outcomes. It shattered the psychological foundation upon which Panzer doctrine rested. German tank crews since 1940 had operated with a fundamental assumption: their armor would protect them while their guns killed the enemy. That equation, survive plus kill equals victory, had held true through Poland, France, the Balkans, and the early years in Russia. Normandy broke it. By August 1944, Wehrmacht training manuals were being hastily revised to address a reality instructors had never anticipated teaching: what to do when your armor advantage disappears. Replacement crews arriving in Normandy received briefings that contradicted everything veterans had learned. Don't close to medium range. Don't assume frontal armor will protect you. Don't present your hull to any Sherman unless you've positively identified it as lacking the long gun. Every "don't" represented a reversal of established practice, and every reversal bred hesitation. Hesitation kills tank crews as surely as armor-piercing shot. A Panther commander who pauses to identify whether that distant Sherman is a Firefly gives the enemy time to shoot first. A Tiger crew that prioritizes survival over aggression surrenders the initiative. By mid-August, German after-action reports described Panzer units adopting increasingly defensive postures, waiting for British tanks to come to them rather than maneuvering to advantageous positions. This represented a complete inversion of German armored doctrine, which had always emphasized aggressive maneuver and seizing the initiative. Morale indicators tell the story statistically. In June 1944, German tank crew replacement rates in Normandy ran at roughly 18% monthly, high but sustainable for units with veteran corps. By August, that figure had climbed to 34%. More tellingly, the percentage of crews requesting transfer to other arms increased fivefold between June and September. Interrogation reports from captured Panzer crewmen reveal a consistent theme. They no longer believed their equipment gave them a decisive advantage, and fighting without that advantage felt like slow-motion suicide. The Wehrmacht's response was to double down on technical solutions. Orders went out to prioritize Firefly destruction above all other tactical considerations. Panzer infantry teams received specific instructions to target Fireflies during coordinated tank infantry engagements. Luftwaffe ground attack units, to the extent they still existed in meaningful numbers, were directed to focus on long-barreled Shermans. None of this addressed the underlying problem. British guns could now kill German tanks frontally at combat ranges, and no amount of target prioritization changed that mathematical reality. German tactical radio discipline, previously exemplary, deteriorated noticeably. British signals intelligence units reported increasing instances of panzer commanders broadcasting in clear language rather than code, sometimes expressing frustration or despair, audible even through translation. One intercepted transmission from August 9th during the Mortain counteroffensive featured a Panther commander screaming that his unit was being murdered by British tanks firing from positions his crew couldn't even identify. The loss of composure was striking for an army that prided itself on professional, disciplined veteran crews adapted, learning to fight more cautiously and with greater respect for British firepower. But Normandy consumed veteran crews at unsustainable rates. Replacements arriving from training depots in Germany lacked the experience to compensate for inferior tactical positions with superior skill. They'd been trained on doctrines that no longer worked, using assumptions that were no longer valid. A panzer regiment in June 1944 might have had 60% veteran crews who knew how to survive. That same regiment in September might have been 70% replacements who died learning lessons that the dead veterans could no longer teach them. The psychological collapse wasn't universal or immediate, but it was real. The Panzer Arm, which had terrorized Europe for 4 years, spent late summer 1944 learning what British tank crews had known since 1940. Fighting with inadequate guns against superior firepower turns every engagement into a calculated risk of death. The 17-pounder's impact extended far beyond Normandy's hedgerows. When American ordnance officers examined Firefly performance data in late 1944, they immediately accelerated development of their own 90mm gun, which appeared on the M26 Pershing in early 1945. Soviet designers, analyzing captured German tanks and intelligence reports about Western guns, upgunned the T-34 from 76 to 85mm, then developed the 100mm D-10 for their IS-2 heavy tanks. The global arms race between penetration and protection, which the 17-pounder had decisively tilted toward. Penetration never stopped escalating. Post-war tank design underwent fundamental revision because of lessons the 17-pounder taught. The British Centurion, which entered service in 1945, was designed from the outset around the 17-pounder. Its turret ring measured 76 inches, specifically to accommodate the gun without the compromises that plagued the Firefly. The Centurion's designers understood that armor alone couldn't guarantee survival. You needed a gun capable of killing anything you might encounter. That philosophy, firepower first, armor second, became NATO standard for the next 3 decades. Soviet doctrine evolved differently but reached similar conclusions. Their IS-3 heavy tank, unveiled in 1945, mounted a 122mm gun capable of defeating any Western tank then in service. The arms race logic was inescapable. If guns could penetrate frontally, armor thickness mattered less than gun caliber and crew training. The Soviets learned from German experiences in Normandy that psychological dominance through superior firepower was more valuable than marginal improvements in protection. Their Cold War tank designs consistently prioritized hitting power over survivability. The 17-pounder itself remained in British service well into the 1950s. Fireflies fought in Korea, where their long-range hitting power proved valuable in mountainous terrain. Towed 17-pounders served as regimental anti-tank weapons until replaced by guided missiles in the early 1960s. The gun's longevity reflected its fundamental soundness. It had been designed to defeat armor that didn't exist in 1941, and that design headroom meant it remained relevant long after lighter guns had become obsolete. What the 17-pounder truly rewrote was the calculus of armored warfare itself. Before Normandy, tank designers believed protection could stay ahead of penetration through thickness and metallurgy. The 17-pounder demonstrated that kinetic energy rounds, properly designed, would always eventually defeat passive armor. This realization drove post-war developments in sloped armor, composite materials, and reactive armor, all attempts to defeat the fundamental physics that the 17-pounder had exploited so successfully. The broader lesson extended beyond tanks. Every military that studied Normandy understood that weapons development couldn't stagnate. The 2-pounder had seemed adequate in 1938. By 1944, it was a death sentence. The 17-pounder seemed dominant in 1944. By 1950, the Soviets had guns that made it look modest. The pace of technological advancement meant that yesterday's wonder weapon became tomorrow's museum piece with frightening speed. Defense establishments that failed to innovate continuously would send their soldiers to die in equipment already obsolete. Britain's experience with the 2-pounder and 17-pounder became a cautionary tale taught in staff colleges worldwide. The story had obvious heroes: the engineers who designed the 17-pounder, the crews who fought with it. But the real lesson was institutional. Militaries must constantly question their assumptions, test their equipment against realistic threat scenarios, and accept uncomfortable truths about inadequacy before those truths are written in soldiers' blood. The men who died in Crusaders and Valentines against Tigers paid the price for institutional complacency. The Germans who died in Panthers and Tigers against Fireflies learned that technological superiority is temporary and that yesterday's predator can become today's prey faster than doctrine can adapt.